The subway car groaned through the tunnel, its wheels screeching against the tracks in a relentless, grinding rhythm that had long since become the city's heartbeat. The air inside was dense, a stifling blend of damp fabric, lingering body odor, and the sharp, metallic tang of the rails seeping through cracked vents. Flickering fluorescent lights cast a sickly, intermittent glow, throwing shadows across the packed car. Passengers jammed the seats and aisles, their faces a mosaic of exhaustion, distraction, and calculated detachment. Some were glued to their phones, thumbs flicking through endless feeds of news, memes, or messages. Others stared blankly at the scuffed floor or the graffiti-scarred windows, their eyes deliberately avoiding contact with the world around them. A few leaned against the poles, swaying with the train's motion, their expressions vacant, as if the journey had drained them of presence. The city's unwritten code, see nothing, say nothing, hung heavy in the air, binding them in a silent pact. At one end of the car, an elderly man sat alone, his frame hunched under a threadbare coat that sagged at the shoulders, its cuffs frayed from years of wear. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, clutched a worn leather bag, its zipper rusted but stubbornly intact, a relic of a life carefully preserved. His face was a map of wrinkles, each line telling a story of resilience, and his eyes, though tired, burned with a quiet dignity. He scanned the car, his gaze lingering on the passengers, averted faces, a faint frown creasing his brow as if he sensed the weight of their indifference. Across from him, a young woman in a faded knit scarf sat rigid, her posture brittle with tension. Her fingers twisted nervously around the strap of a small purse, its fabric worn thin at the edges. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line, and her eyes darted toward the floor, as if she could will herself invisible by sheer force of will. A shadow loomed over her seat, a thug in a hooded jacket, his silhouette sharp and menacing, like a blade cutting through the car's stale air. His silver chain glinted under the flickering lights, a cheap badge of bravado, and a knife was clipped to his belt, its blade catching the fluorescence with a cold, predatory gleam. He leaned in close, his voice a low, guttural hiss that carried a casual cruelty. "Empty the bag, now." The words were heavy with threat, his breath hot on her cheek. The woman froze, her breath catching in her throat as her trembling hands fumbled with the purse's clasp, her fingers clumsy with panic. Her eyes flicked upward, a silent, desperate plea for help, but the passengers around her seemed to shrink further into themselves. A businessman in a rumpled suit glanced over the rim of his glasses, his lips parting briefly before he buried his face in his tablet, his fingers tapping faster, as if work could erase the scene. A teenager with neon earbuds smirked faintly, slipping his phone from his pocket to record, his lens already framing the confrontation for likes and shares. A mother in a worn parka pulled her young son closer, her hand shielding his eyes as she whispered urgently for him to stay quiet, her voice trembling. A young man in a hoodie scrolled faster on his phone, his jaw tight, as if the screen could block out reality. The train's hum droned on, oblivious, its mechanical indifference a stark contrast to the human drama unfolding within its walls. The elderly man shifted in his seat, his joints creaking as he straightened, his movements slow but deliberate. He cleared his throat, the sound sharp and defiant, cutting through the car's oppressive silence like a blade. "Leave her be," he said, his voice thin but unwavering, carrying a conviction that belied his frail frame. The thug's head snapped toward him, his eyes narrowing to slits, a predator startled by unexpected resistance. "What did you say, old man?" he growled, stepping away from the woman to loom over the elderly man's seat, his posture radiating menace. The woman seized the moment, slipping her purse behind her back, her movements quick but shaky, her breath hitching as she pressed herself against the seat. The thug noticed, his hand shooting out to grab the elderly man's collar, yanking him to his feet with a force that made the nearby passengers flinch. "You wanna be a hero?" he snarled, his face inches from the old man's, his breath sour with malice. The leather bag slipped from the man's hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud that echoed like a gunshot in the silent car, its contents, a few papers, a battered book, spilling across the grimy tiles. The air thickened, the passengers, silence a suffocating, palpable weight. A woman in a red coat clutched her purse tighter, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on her shoes as if they held salvation. A middle-aged man in a flat cap adjusted his glasses, his gaze flickering toward the scene before darting away, his hands fidgeting in his lap. The teenager's camera stayed trained on the confrontation, his lens capturing every detail, the thug's sneer, the old man's trembling hands, the woman's frozen panic, his face alight with the thrill of content creation. The mother in the parka tightened her grip on her son, her whispers growing more frantic, her body angled to shield him from the escalating threat. The young man in the hoodie paused his scrolling, his phone forgotten, his jaw slack as he watched, torn between fear and fascination. The thug's lips curled into a cruel grin as he shoved the old man against the wall, pinning him with a forearm to his chest, the force rattling the metal panel behind him. "You think anyone here gives a damn about you?" he mocked, his voice loud enough to make the nearest passengers shrink back, their eyes averted, their silence a betrayal. He pulled the knife free, its blade glinting as he pressed it close to the old man's throat, just enough to draw a sharp gasp, a bead of sweat trickling down the man's weathered cheek. "Last chance, Grandpa," he said, his grin widening, feeding on the fear that saturated the air. "Sit down, or you're done." The car seemed to freeze, time itself suspended in the flickering light. The hum of the train, the distant rumble of the tunnel, the faint buzz of a phone notification, all faded into a single, taut moment, the world reduced to the glint of the blade in the old man's shallow breaths. The passengers, inaction hung heavy, their averted gazes a collective surrender to fear, their phones and screams a flimsy shield against the violence unfolding before them. The thug's confidence swelled, his knife steady now, his eyes gleaming with the power of unchallenged dominance, his sneer daring anyone to intervene. Then, a faint creak cut through the stillness, a sound so subtle it might have been lost in any other moment, yet it landed like a thunderclap in the charged silence. At the far end of the car, a figure rose from his seat, slow and deliberate, as if he'd been waiting, watching, biding his time since the train left the station. He was unremarkable at first glance, close-cropped hair, a weathered leather jacket, hands tucked casually in his pockets, his frame compact but solid. But as he stood, the air shifted, the car seeming to bend toward him, as if gravity itself acknowledged his presence. Jason Statham. His face was a mask of calm, his jaw set, his eyes, sharp, unyielding, like twin shards of obsidian, locked onto the thug with an intensity that made the temperature plummet. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every head turned, even those pretending not to notice, drawn by the quiet, undeniable power radiating from him, a force that seemed to rewrite the rules of the moment. The thug's grin faltered, his bravado cracking like glass under a hammer. He tightened his grip on the old man, his fingers digging into the threadbare coat, but his eyes flicked to Jason, who took a single step forward. The sound of his boots against the grimy floor was heavy, deliberate, a slow, resonant beat that seemed to sync with the thug's quickening pulse, each step a countdown. "What's your problem, mate?" the thug barked, his voice louder than necessary, betraying a tremor of unease that he couldn't mask. Jason didn't answer. He took another step, his gaze never wavering, cutting through the thug's confidence like a blade through silk, his silence louder than any threat. The passengers, still filming, shifted their lenses, their whispers fading into a hush, their phones trembling slightly in their hands. The teenager's smirk vanished, his phone now steady as he captured the shift in power, his earlier thrill replaced by a quiet awe. The businessman's tablet slipped further in his hands, his fingers frozen, his attention no longer on his screen. The mother loosened her grip on her son, her eyes fixed on Jason, a flicker of hope breaking through her fear. The woman in the red coat lifted her gaze for the first time, her breath catching as she watched, her purse no longer a shield. The young man in the hoodie met Jason's gaze for a fleeting moment, then looked away, his jaw tight, his phone forgotten. The thug's knife hand twitched, the blade wavering against the old man's throat, its tip no longer steady. He glanced at it, then back at Jason, who was now halfway down the aisle, his presence a gathering storm, quiet but overwhelming, filling the car with a weight that pressed against every chest. The old man, still pinned, watched with wide eyes, his breath shallow but unbroken, a spark of defiance reigniting in his weathered face as he sensed the tide turning. The woman with the purse clutched it tighter, her knuckles white, her scarf slipping as she leaned forward, her eyes darting between Jason and the thug, her panic tempered by a growing hope. The middle-aged man in the flat cap adjusted his glasses again, his hands still fidgeting, but his gaze lingered on Jason now, as if seeing him for the first time. The mother's whispers softened, her son peeking out from her embrace, his wide eyes fixed on the man who seemed to command the car without a word. The car's lights flickered again, casting Jason's shadow long and dark across the aisle, a silent promise of reckoning that seemed to stretch beyond the moment. Jason's steps were unhurried, each one eroding the thug's confidence further, stripping away the layers of bravado that had sustained him. The thug tried to laugh, but it came out as a nervous bark, hollow and unconvincing, swallowed by the car's hum. "You think you're tough," he said, shoving the old man harder against the wall, the metal panel rattling, as if physical force could reclaim his crumbling authority. But his eyes kept returning to Jason, who moved closer still, his hands still in his pockets, his stance relaxed but coiled, like a panther stalking prey through tall grass. The subway lurched, the lights flickering for a moment, bathing the car in brief darkness before the fluorescents buzzed back to life, their harsh glow illuminating the sweat beading on the thug's brow. His sneer was gone now, replaced by a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth, his bravado dissolving under the weight of that unrelenting stare, those eyes that seemed to see through him, past the knife, past the chain, to the fear he couldn't hide. Jason stopped a few feet away, his presence a wall of quiet menace, his shadow falling across the thug like a sentence. The thug's shoulders hunched, his knife hand trembling visibly now, the blade no longer a threat but a liability. "Back off, man," he said, his voice cracking, the words more plea than command, his bravado reduced to a fragile shell. Jason tilted his head slightly, the smallest of movements, but it was enough to make the thug flinch, his body recoiling as if braced for a blow that hadn't come, his knife wavering dangerously close to slipping from his grip. The passengers watched, their phones still raised, but the air had changed, charged, electric, as if the car itself was holding its breath, every soul suspended in the gravity of the moment. The teenager lowered his phone slightly, his earlier thrill replaced by a quiet reverence, his lens no longer seeking clout but bearing witness. The businessman set his tablet down, his face flushed with something like shame, his eyes locked on Jason. The mother's whispers to her son softened to a hum, her son's face peeking out, his fear giving way to fascination. The woman in the red coat exhaled, her shoulders relaxing, her eyes glistening with something like gratitude. The middle-aged man in the flat cap leaned forward, his fidgeting hands still, his glasses reflecting the flickering lights. "Walk away," Jason said, his voice low, rough, like gravel underfoot, each syllable heavy with finality. It wasn't loud, but it carried, slicing through the hum of the train and the thug's faltering resolve, resonating in the car like a verdict. The words hung in the air, not a suggestion but a promise, laced with unspoken consequences that needed no elaboration. The thug's jaw clenched, his eyes flicking between Jason and the door, calculating his escape, his mind racing to salvage what was left of his pride. He muttered a string of curses, his voice barely audible, his bravado reduced to ash, his silver chain swaying as he shifted his weight. He shoved the old man aside, the force weaker now, almost petulant, the knife disappearing into his pocket as he backed toward the exit, his movements jerky, like a cornered animal desperate for an out. "This ain't worth it," he mumbled, more to himself than anyone else, his eyes darting to Jason one last time, searching for a challenge he no longer had the stomach to meet, his earlier swagger a distant memory. The train screeched to a stop, the doors hissing open with a rush of cold, stale air from the platform, carrying the faint echo of announcements and footsteps. The thug stumbled out, his hood pulled low, his silver chain catching the light one last time as he vanished into the sea of commuters, swallowed by the crowd like a shadow fleeing the dawn. The car exhaled, the tension snapping like a taut wire, the air suddenly lighter, as if the subway itself had been holding its breath. The elderly man slumped back into his seat, his hands trembling as he retrieved his bag from the floor, gathering the spilled papers and book with careful, deliberate movements. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse, his eyes brimming with gratitude and relief as he looked at Jason, his hands steadying as he clutched the bag to his chest. The young woman nodded, her scarf slipping further as she clutched her purse, her lips moving as if to speak but finding no words, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her breathing finally evening out. The businessman cleared his throat, his tablet forgotten, his face a mix of guilt and admiration as he adjusted his glasses, his earlier detachment replaced by a quiet respect. The teenager slipped his phone into his pocket, the video unsent, his earlier bravado replaced by a somber acknowledgement of the moment's weight. The mother in the parka smiled faintly, her son peeking out from her embrace, his wide eyes fixed on Jason, his fear giving way to wonder. The woman in the red coat tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes lingering on Jason before turning to the window, her reflection softened by relief. The middle-aged man in the flat cap leaned back, his hands finally still, a faint nod of approval crossing his face. The young man in the hoodie exhaled, his shoulders slumping, his phone dark in his lap. Jason returned to his seat, his expression unchanged, as if the moment had been no more significant than brushing dust from his jacket or stepping over a puddle. He leaned back, his eyes drifting to the dark tunnel walls flashing by outside, his silence louder than the train's rumble, a presence that filled the car without effort. The car felt different now, alive, vibrating with the aftershock of what had happened, the air charged with a newfound awareness. Passengers stole glances at him, their murmurs barely audible, a mix of curiosity, reverence, and something like shame for their own inaction, their earlier detachment exposed in the light of his quiet resolve. The teenager hesitated, then leaned back in his seat, his phone untouched, his earlier thrill replaced by a quiet introspection. The young man in the hoodie met Jason's gaze for a fleeting moment, then looked away, his jaw tight, his fingers twitching as if itching to type but finding no words. The woman in the red coat adjusted her purse, her movements softer now, her eyes tracing the ceiling before settling on the window, where the tunnel's darkness seemed less oppressive. The middle-aged man in the flat cap pulled out a handkerchief, wiping his glasses, his movements slow, as if processing the moment's gravity. The train lurched forward, the hum resuming as it plunged deeper into the tunnel, the lights flickering once more, casting brief shadows across the car, their edges softer now, less jagged. No one spoke to Jason. No one needed to. His presence lingered, a quiet reminder of the line between chaos and order, drawn in a single moment of unspoken authority, a line that had shifted the car's fragile ecosystem. The elderly man adjusted his coat, his hands steadier now, his bag resting securely in his lap, his eyes lingering on the spilled book, a dog-eared copy of a poetry collection, before tucking it away. The young woman tucked her scarf tighter, her breathing even, her eyes tracing the floor before lifting to the window, where the tunnel's darkness seemed to hold less menace, her reflection a mix of relief and resolve. The businessman folded his tablet shut, his fingers lingering on the case, his mind elsewhere, his earlier urgency replaced by a quiet contemplation. The mother hummed softly to her son, her voice a gentle anchor in the car's renewed calm, her son's face bright with curiosity as he whispered a question she answered with a smile. The woman in the red coat shifted in her seat, her purse resting lightly in her lap, her posture no longer defensive. The middle-aged man in the flat cap slipped his handkerchief back into his pocket, his glasses clean, his gaze softer now, as if seeing the car anew. The story of the subway car would spread, whispered in break rooms, recounted over drinks in dimly lit bars, shared in fragmented clips online, the videos spreading like wildfire across platforms, captioned with awe, speculation, and hashtags that tried to capture the moment's weight. Some would call Jason a hero, others a vigilante, some would debate the passengers, inaction, their phones a symbol of cowardice or caution. The clips would rack up views, the comments sections a battleground of opinions, but none would capture the truth of the car, the raw, unspoken bond. Forged among strangers, the weight of fear and relief, the silent acknowledgement of a man who'd shifted the balance without raising his voice. Here, now, it was theirs, a fleeting connection carried in stolen glances, in the softening of postures, in the quiet that followed the storm. The train slowed as it approached the next station, the platform's lights bleeding through the windows, illuminating the car in a softer, warmer glow. The passengers shifted, preparing to disembark, their movements quieter, more deliberate, as if carrying the moment with them, a story etched into their bones. Jason remained seated, his gaze fixed on the tunnel ahead, a man apart yet indelibly woven into the fabric of their shared memory, his silence the loudest story of all, resonating long after the doors closed and the train carried them into the city's endless pulse.